supporting it. So that's good news.
And we've been talking with Senator Ben Cardin, a Democrat of Maryland, currently in his second term, a member of the Finance Committee, as well as the Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you for your time this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And the House of Representatives is coming into session.
The House will be in order. Prayer will be offered by our chaplain, Father Conroy.
Let us pray. Compassionate and merciful God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. As this House comes together at the end of a busy week, bless the work of its members. May their legislative actions bring about positive results which redound to the benefit of all citizens of our nation. As the members return to their home districts, fill their hearts with charity, their minds with understanding, their wills with courage to listen well and reflect back with the expertise and knowledge they possess, greater insight for American voters. The work that they have is difficult work. May they rise together to accomplish what is best for our great nation and indeed for all the world. May all that is done in the days to come be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 1, Rule 1, I demand a vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal.
Questions on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal? Those in favor indicate by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The journal stands approved. The gentleman from Arizona. Mr.
Speaker, I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present, and to make the point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Chair will entertain up to 5 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, today I proudly recognize the 5th anniversary and expansion of, quote, My Possibilities, a nonprofit organization serving disabled young adults in North Texas. My Possibilities began with the vision of 3 dedicated mothers of special needs children. These mothers dreamed of something more for their kids beyond a high school education, and after 2 years of hard work, they created their first full-day, full-year continuing education program for disabled Texans. In fact, last week commemorated the grand opening of a new facility in Plano so even more Texans could become lifelong learners. My Possibilities stands as a testament to the American spirit of freedom and free enterprise. 3 moms took an idea to fill a need in our community and made it a reality. That's truly remarkable. The folks at My Possibilities live up to their motto, quote, make every moment count. To the staff, Board of Directors, and Chairman Charmaine Solomon, thank you for your tireless efforts and your dedication. Yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Illinois rise? She's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today, as I have before, on behalf of the many families victimized daily by the persistent gun violence in their communities. As a nation, we shudder at tragedies like the Newtown shootings. The news coverage of Newtown left an indelible mark on our collective conscience. Yet, sadly, every day, equally devastating acts of gun violence occur in urban America, often without the same media coverage. Since Newtown, over 6,000 Americans have lost their lives to gun violence. Still, Congress has yet to act on common-sense gun reforms that would save lives. Every life lost, regardless of zip code, is a tragedy. It's easy to get angry and frustrated over the relentless drumbeat of death in urban America, but instead we need to turn our anger and frustration into action. In my 3 months in Congress, I've introduced 3 common-sense gun bills that will help make our communities safer. Though federal legislation alone cannot solve the gun violence epidemic, it is a strong start and a step in the right direction. So I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor these bills and take a stand with me against the gun violence. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise? Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to shed light on Attorney General Eric Holder's less than glamorous tenure as Attorney General. As the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of our nation, Mr. Holder is expected to govern to the principles of seeking justice. As a sworn federal official, he has one primary job: to enforce the laws of the United States fairly and impartially. It is for that reason that Lady Justice wears a blindfold. The blindfold represents objectivity, and that justice should be dealt out without fear, favor, or impartiality. How come Mr. Holder dispenses his version of justice impartially? How come the Attorney General overlooked actual injustices and the disregard for the rule of law? As Supreme Court Justice Brandeis said, in a government of laws, the existence of government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. If government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become law unto himself. It invites anarchy. I ask you then, has the Attorney General invited anarchy? I will continue to make my case here at the People's House, at the People's Pulpit. Folks, I will be back.
For what purpose does the gentleman of California rise?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge the 30th anniversary of National Night Out. America's Night Out Against Crime began those 30 years ago to encourage community-based crime prevention. I've participated in many National Night Out events throughout my district over the years, meeting people who are committed to reducing crime in their neighborhoods and promoting community spirit by building relationships with their local civic leaders and law enforcement officials. This year, I look forward to celebrating National Night Out in Stockton, California, a city in my district. National Night Out has made a difference in my district by bringing people together and making them more aware of how to keep their neighborhoods safe. National Night Out has grown to over 37 million Americans participating in 15,000 communities across North America. National Night Out illustrates how partnerships between community members and local law enforcement can prevent crime. I encourage my colleagues to participate in National Night Out events in their own districts. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah rise? The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, like you as a fellow Utahn, this week my heart is back in my district and my state as we celebrate our great pioneer heritage. On July 24th, 1847, Brigham Young stood over the Great Salt Lake Valley, which was nothing but a desert devoid of any green meadows, and he uttered those famous words, "This is the place." After traveling more than 1,300 miles, crossing the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, the pioneers settled to begin a new life. Throughout this, they suffered great hardships: hunger, fatigue, cold, disease, exhaustion. During their journeys, they quickly called Utah home as they reached this great valley, and when they planted their crops and went to work building beautiful communities, they grew it into the wonderful city and state that we now know. Our state has much to be proud of. We have the greatest snow on earth. Our national parks are truly magnificent. Our state is consistently rated among the top in job creation, education, and quality of life. Utah truly has some of the most honest, hardworking, and friendly people in the country. Pioneer Day is celebrated to honor everyone who immigrated west to Utah during our great pioneer heritage, who aided in creating this great state, and I'm proud to call Utah my home. I yield back my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise. I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, just last week I had the privilege of speaking to students who attend Florida International University in my district. These students included Democrats, they included Republicans, and independents, but their message was clear. It is time for Congress to help keep college affordable. And that is why I have supported efforts to prevent and reverse the doubling of the federal student loan rates, which took effect on July 1st. This issue is too important for us to delay any further. I was very encouraged that the Senate yesterday passed a strongly bipartisan compromise bill to lower these rates. I urge the House leadership, Mr. Speaker, to bring this bill to the floor and keep college rates affordable for our nation's students. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise? The gentleman is recognized for a minute.
Mr. Speaker, it is my privilege to co-chair the International Religious Freedom Caucus here in the Congress, and in that capacity it's also my privilege to participate in the Defending Freedoms Project, a bipartisan effort for members of Congress to adopt a prisoner of conscience. My office has adopted Saeed Abedini, a Christian pastor and an American citizen from Idaho who is currently imprisoned in Iran for his faith. Iran's tyrannical attempts to, in the words of Ronald Reagan, stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people have been exposed again to the world after the imprisonment of Pastor Abedini, who was sentenced to 8 years in prison while working to build an orphanage in Iran. Mr. Speaker, Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And Pastor Abedini's case is a demonstration to the world of the far-reaching implications of even a single instance of human rights abuse. And I would call again upon Iran to immediately release Pastor Abedini so he can return to Idaho to be with his family. And I yield back.
For what purpose the gentleman from Virginia rise? The gentleman is recognized for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 10 years ago today, this body unanimously passed PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which my colleague from Virginia, Frank Wolf, and I sponsored. PREA is designed to end sexual violence in our nation's prisons. One focus of PREA is on reducing assaults on children in our criminal justice system. Youthful inmates are more likely than their adult counterparts to be victimized by prison staff and adult inmates. Under PREA, no youth under 18 years of age can be placed in a housing unit where contact with adult inmates may occur. Furthermore, children in adult jails and prisons are often placed in solitary confinement for their own protection, which turns out to be detrimental to their mental health. Due to this type of confinement and exposure to abuse, youth have the highest rates of suicide amongst all inmates. PREA urges agencies to avoid subjecting children to solitary confinement. Mr. Speaker, I call on the Department of Justice to redouble its efforts to ensure that every state implements PREA to protect all inmates from sexual violence. The type of sexual violence that has plagued our prisons and jails is cruel and unusual punishment and should not be part of an inmate's prison term. Thank you. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Tennessee rise?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Please recognize for a minute.
Mr. Speaker, on July the 4th, the Obama administration updated the Federal Register. And buried in more than 600 pages of this new regulation was a controversial decision to delay verification of eligibility for Obamacare subsidies and instead use the honor system, which more accurately should be described as an open invitation for fraud and abuse. In a desperate attempt to try to save the President's failing health care law, the administration is willing to give out billions of dollars in fraudulent payments, racking up even more debt for current and future generations, and this is indispensable. That is why I have introduced H.R. 2775, the No Subsidies Without Verification Act. My bill would stop this irresponsible action by requiring that verification systems be put in place before any subsidy is paid with taxpayer money. I urge my colleagues to join me in this fight and support H.R. 2775. I yield back.
For what purpose the gentleman from California rise?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House and to revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, every day a member of the Safe Climate Caucus has come to the floor to raise concern about climate change. And we know about climate change from hurricanes and tornadoes and droughts and all the other things that we're seeing. But yesterday, the prestigious science journal Nature published an analysis of the cost of rapid warming in the Arctic. And that analysis found that the cost could range from $10 trillion to over $200 trillion. The mean cost is $60 trillion. I'm not misspeaking. It's not 60 million, it's not 60 billion, but it's $60 trillion. These enormous costs are the consequence of the release of 50 gigatons of methane now trapped in the Arctic ice shelves, which experts believe will be released into the air within the next 50 years, if not sooner, if we don't stop spewing carbon pollution into our atmosphere. The Arctic is pivotal to the functioning of the Earth's systems, the oceans, and the climate, but we're recklessly endangering it. We need to stop acting like members of the Flat Earth Society and start listening to the urgent warnings of the scientists.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 2315, Preserving Access to Orphan Drugs of 2013, be re-referred to the Committee on Ways and Means and in addition to the Committee on Energy and Commerce.
Without exception. Pursuant to the House Resolution 315 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2218. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House of the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2218, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to amend Subtitle D of the Solid Waste Disposal Act to encourage recovery and beneficial use of coal combustion residuals and establish requirements for the proper management and disposal of coal combustion residuals that are protective of human health and the environment.
Pursuant to the rule, this bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, each will control 30 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 2218.
Thank you. The request needs to be made in the full House, not in the Committee of the Whole.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the time that I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have spent much time talking about the need for Congress to consider jobs legislation. This is a piece of pro-job legislation. This bill is unique because it also is a pro-states' rights legislation and pro-environmental legislation. But focusing on jobs for a minute, let me explain why a no vote is an anti-jobs, placing anywhere from 39,000 to 316,000 jobs at risk at a time when we can least afford it. We are here because for over 3 years ago, the EPA put out 3 proposals on coal ash, including regulating coal ash as a hazardous waste. This caused massive uncertainty in the marketplace and created an unnecessary stigma on a legitimate recycling of this product. And I have a piece of shingle that's made and produced by coal ash. As the states agree, as highlighted in a letter from the state of Michigan in support of H.R. 2218, enactment would end the regulatory uncertainty that has hindered our efforts to promote the beneficial use of coal and combustion residuals. EPA announced in litigation proceedings recently that it will not have a final coal ash rule before 2014. The fact that EPA continues to leave a hazardous waste designation on the table, even though 3 decades of science and fact and point the other way that coal ash is not hazardous, it directly is contributing to the loss of current and future recycling. Coal ash is not an abstract substance. It is used in important infrastructure in this country. The American Coal Ash Association informed us that uncertainty in the marketplace caused by EPA's proposal to regulate coal ash as hazardous waste is diminishing their economic prospects down to just 40% of eligible coal waste, and they support this bill. This bill establishes a solid framework for regulation of coal combustion residuals in a manner that is protective of human health and the environment or the state environmental regulators, including the Environmental Council of the States, ECOS, and the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials, would not be endorsing this bill. Coal ash makes concrete stronger, more durable, and cheaper. A no vote against this bill means that you support less durable, more expensive highway, schools, and green buildings. Don't take my word for it. The American Road and Transportation Builders Association and many other road and bridge builders, and also the Building and Construction Trades Union, wants this bill because they want high-quality construction material for buildings, roads, and bridges. For members concerned about wallboard from China, coal ash is stable, domestic source for wallboard, and will control costs. Don't take my word for it. The American Forest and Paper Association supports this bill. Mine workers across this country need a stable way of having America's energy future secured. This bill accomplishes that. Don't take my word for it. Ask the United Mine Workers who support this bill. Coal ash is recycled and used as a raw material in making cement. Voting no means you choose to put coal ash in landfills rather than putting it back into roads and building projects. Don't take my word for it. Organizations like Portland Cement Association, the Phoenix Cement Company, and the Wisconsin Ready Mix Concrete Association and the Washington Aggregates and Concrete Association, they all support this bill. A vote against this bill is a vote for prolonged regulatory uncertainty. A vote against this bill is a vote to increase costs on the federal, state, and local governments and infrastructures. A vote against this bill is a vote to increase costs on all Americans and to dare unemployment to go even higher. A vote against this bill is a direct message to career state employees in states across this country that you do not trust them to do the right thing regarding regulation of coal ash. This bill is a pro-jobs, pro-environment, anti-bureaucracy bill. If you want progress instead of process, protection instead of politics, and jobs instead of a continued uncertainty, vote for this bill. We find ourselves in this morass of regulatory uncertainty because the existing approach to environmental regulation. This bill presents a new approach that will reduce the inefficiencies of our federal rulemaking process by setting a national standard in the statute and charging the states with implementation. If you support protecting jobs and preserving state rights, and if you trust your state environmental regulators to protect your communities, you need to support this bill and vote yes on final passage. And with this, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Today, the House is considering legislation to block EPA from acting to ensure that toxic coal ash is safely disposed of. The coal ash is the result of the coal that has been burned, and this coal ash needs to be disposed of. Now, what the Republicans who are suggesting this bill be adopted are suggesting is that we remove public health protections in order to allow polluting disposal sites to continue with business as usual. And that's a little tough to justify. As we led up to today's debate, we've heard some outlandish justifications, and I just want to set the record straight. First of all, we've been told this is a states' rights bill because we need this legislation in order for the states to impose adequate regulation on dangerous coal ash disposal sites. Well, that's not true. The states can regulate coal ash disposal today, and in fact, many do. The problem is that many states are not doing a good job. For example, in Ohio, the coal ash disposal sites have serious groundwater contamination problems. The coal ash at these sites have contaminated groundwater with arsenic, mercury, and radioactive levels of materials higher than allowed under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Well, in total, EPA has identified 133 cases of groundwater and surface water contamination at coal ash disposal sites. All of this has occurred under existing law where state laws can be effective and states can act. The problem is they're not all acting. Secondly, the proponents of this bill have argued we have to pass this legislation to allow coal ash to be recycled. Well, they argue EPA wants to designate coal ash as, quote, hazardous, end quote. Well, that isn't what EPA proposed at all. They say that this designation would be a stigma on coal ash and it would ensure there would be no longer any market for recycled coal ash, but that argument is just plain wrong. Hazardous labeling and restrictions on beneficial reuse are simply not at issue. When EPA issued its proposed coal ash rule, the agency offered a couple of alternatives. Neither of these proposals would involve labeling coal ash as hazardous. And quite frankly, even if it were designated hazardous, that doesn't mean it can't be reused. It can be reused. Third, we've been told that we must pass this legislation because it's a careful compromise from the version of the last Congress. Well, I'm not sure who was in that compromise, because the bill is even worse than the bill from the last Congress. The Republicans have refused to work with the Democrats on the committee. There's no bipartisan coal ash bill in the Senate. The administration has identified 5 problems with the bill that cause it to fall short of protecting human health and the environment. Let's focus on the reality. This debate is not about a war on coal or putting a stigma on coal ash. It's not about whether state governments are inherently better than the federal government. It's not about job-killing regulations. This debate is about whether or not we're going to allow coal ash disposal sites to contaminate our water supplies and threaten human health. If this bill is enacted, coal ash disposal sites will continue to pollute our groundwater. And once contamination is confirmed, well, this bill would allow it to continue for another 10 years and do nothing. And then after that, they might even continue it for another indefinite period of time. So it will continue to pollute groundwater, the water we drink, and our water supplies and our water sources. This bill says that a dump site that is contaminating groundwater today can pollute for 10 years. More arsenic, more mercury, more lead. Is that what members of the House want to vote for? If the owners of the polluting structure can't control their contamination within 10 years, this bill says states can give them even more time to keep polluting. New information released yesterday reveals that 3/4 of existing unlined coal ash impoundments do not have the space at their existing locations to construct an additional disposal facility. Those facts practically guarantee that if this legislation were to be enacted, communities across the country, many of them poor and minority, will simply have to endure contaminated water, polluted air, and the risk of catastrophic dam failure. And why? For states' rights, where the states already have the rights? It's really for polluter rights. And polluters do not have and should not have a right to pollute our water supplies. This can be handled effectively through a serious piece of legislation that will make clear that public health protection must be enforced. I urge my colleagues to tune out the special interest misinformation that seeks to weaken our laws, prolong pollution, and oppose this legislation. No matter how you voted in the last Congress, this bill is worse, and I urge members to vote against it today. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask my colleague to look at the 11 additional changes that have been made in this bill versus the last bill and realize how much we have moved in the direction that he speaks of. I now recognize the author of the legislation, Mr. McKinley, for 7 minutes.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of H.R. 2218. For 33 years, Congress has wrestled unproductively with how to deal with coal ash, an unavoidable byproduct of burning coal. After countless hearings, meetings, and amendments, we come here today with a solution. Over the past 2.5 years, we've listened to environmental organizations, industry, senators, the states, the EPA. Now the bill has strong bipartisan support with Democrat co-sponsors and a broad coalition of over 300 organizations and businesses, including state environmental officials, governors, recyclers, manufacturers, coal miners, coal operators, and labor unions, just to name a few. If we don't act decisively, Congress will once again kick the can down the road. That would mean the status quo continues. At the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee hearing on the draft legislation earlier this year, EPA Assistant Administrator Matthew Stanislaus testified that states have the ability to ensure proper management and disposal of coal ash under this legislation. At that hearing, my good friend from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, asked Mr. Stanislaus if the EPA was not opposed to this language of the bill. Stanislaus' response was, "That is correct." Even the President has become engaged in this debate. The statement from the administration this past week noted they appreciate the efforts of the House and issued no veto threat. No opposition was expressed. That ought to tell you something. The opponents of this legislation should read the last sentence of the administration's statement. The administration would like to work with Congress to allow for the development, implementation, and enforcement of appropriate standards for managing coal combustion residuals while encouraging the beneficial use of this economically important material. Let me show you what we're talking about here. This is a jar of fly ash. Every day, coal ash is produced in 48 of our 50 states across America. This is a national issue, not just one for coal states. Over 140 million tons of coal ash are produced annually. Approximately 40% of the material is recycled into everyday products used in households and the construction industry. The remaining 60% is disposed of in landfills. Now, 2218 deals separately with both of these issues. The first part deals with recycling. Early in the Obama administration, the EPA proposed a rule to declare coal ash as a hazardous material, despite the fact that under the Bill Clinton administration, the EPA had already determined in 1993 and 2000 the coal ash was not hazardous. Let me repeat that. They've already said it's not hazardous. No industrialized nation in the world classifies fly ash as a hazardous material. Deeming it such would essentially destroy the ability to recycle coal ash, dramatically increase the cost of electricity, and crush hundreds of thousands of jobs across America. The United States already has a much lower rate of recycling than other countries. Europe recycles over 90% of the fly ash, China over 65%, and Japan 95% of their coal ash is recycled. We should be encouraging recycling, not standing in the way. The second part of the bill deals with processes for disposing of coal ash that is not recycled. The section has been significantly strengthened and provides for all new and existing landfills to be state-run using the federal law known as RCRA, which incorporates federal standards and requirements for protecting, quote, human health and the environment. RCRA's primary goal are to, quote, protect human health and the environment, to reduce the amount of waste generated, and to ensure that wastes are managed in an environmentally sound manner. Consequently, under this bill, disposal requirements will require composite liners, air quality and dust controls, groundwater protection standards, emergency action plans, corrective actions for deficiencies, inspections of structural stability. Let's make it clear. If a landfill ever becomes deficient, it must be fixed. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's just that simple. For example, under the corrective action under Section 4011, subsection C2B, the owner and operator of a deficient facility is not relieved of their obligation to develop alternative disposal capabilities, regardless of whether they have the space site available. For anyone to argue otherwise, perhaps they haven't read the bill. For the first time, there will be a uniform national stand for disposal. Or Congress can do nothing. It can, just like it has been for the last 33 years. But I don't think we should continue with the status quo. Working in this bipartisan fashion, we've made progress. After 30 years of debate, it's time for action. Our constituents deserve protection for their health and environment. This legislation makes it possible. We often hear Congress isn't voting on a jobs bill. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, there's not a clear jobs bill that we're going to deal with in this Congress. Protecting 316,000 jobs across America and preventing utility bills to increase. We must protect these jobs. I encourage all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this pro-health, pro-environment, and pro-jobs legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, the administration and I would like to work out a bill with the Republicans. But this bill has two problems. After all is said and done, there is no requirement that they protect public health and the environment. There's all sorts of language to say we want them to, but if states don't do that, there's a second problem is there's no enforcement. There's nothing to make them do it. Now, if you have no real clear standard to protect public health and no enforcement to make sure public health is being protected, that's a bill that's asking for continuation of pollution of our groundwater supplies. We can work together and get a bill. But this administration has said it does not adequately protect public health and the environment. It doesn't address the real problems. Even some of the changes that they have made this bill worse. It's a bill that we should reject and then go back to the negotiating table. Mr. Chairman, at this point I wish to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the subcommittee on energy, on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
And from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, here we go again. With the Republicans spewing their shamelessly empty rhetoric concerning jobs. Jobs for the American people might be on their minds. Jobs for the American people might be in their mouths, but jobs for the American people are not in their hearts. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are arguing that we need to weaken our environmental laws to create jobs. That's incredibly short-sighted. Do we really want to say to the American people that they must suffer contaminated groundwater, drink dirty water? Is that what we're saying? A study from Tufts University shows just the opposite. It's not a fight between jobs and clean environment, clean water, clean drinking water. The Tufts study says that we can create tens of thousands of new jobs by requiring safe disposal of coal ash. Ensuring that coal ash disposal sites protect human health and the environment will take work, will create jobs. It will take construction workers, equipment operators, and engineers to do this work. And let me add that this is not just makeshift work. These jobs will provide tremendous benefits to the communities in which they take place. But these jobs won't happen if we pass this atrocious bill. This bill simply preserves the status quo and keep Americans out of work. Mr. Chairman, when it comes to protecting the public health and ensuring that all Americans have unhindered access to clean air, land, and water, I am very, very sensitive to the issue of ensuring that there are, at the very least, minimum state or federal standards, and that the U.S. EPA has the full authority to enforce those standards. Mr. Chairman, due to a case in my district of Crestwood, Illinois, where contaminated drinking water was piped into the homes of my constituents for over 20 years, between 1986 and 2007. And the state of Illinois refused to intervene. I cannot support legislation that bars the U.S. EPA from enforcing state or federal standards, as this atrocious, shameful bill does. Mr. Chairman, states' rights might mean states' inaction, as in the case of Crestwood, Illinois, where it was only the determined, courageous act of a citizen by the name of Tricia Krause, who had the courage to alert the media to this shameful act being committed by elected officials, those responsible for taking care of the public health and ensuring that the environment was safe, and the water that in the morning, in the evening, during the day that they drank was safe. These officials, these local officials had that responsibility, and they turned their back on the people of the village of Crestwood. And not only did they turn their back, not only did they
Chairman's
turn their
recognized
back,
for one additional minute.
not only did they turn their back, but the Illinois EPA, the state EPA, refused to even investigate this matter. I had to get the U.S. Justice Department and the U.S. EPA to end this atrocity. If this bill is ever enacted, it will bar the federal government, at the very least, from serving as the last backstop for the American people against polluters who will seek to skirt the law without regard to the families and communities that they serve. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the people who are members of this Congress, who have a heart and a mind to not only put the American people back to work, but also to protect the environment.
Time has expired.
This effort and vote no on this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
And my colleagues that the administration has not issued a veto threat on this bill, and I'd now like to recognize the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, for 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from West Virginia for his outstanding work on this legislation, and also to Mr. Shimkus, who is the chairman of the subcommittee, for his leadership on the issue. And I do rise today in support of the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act of 2013. I'm an original co-sponsor on that legislation. Now, I think it comes as no surprise to anybody that this administration has declared their war on coal. You can listen to the comments that are coming out of the President and his advisors there at the White House. They've done everything in their power to shut down coal plants and to put American coal miners on the unemployment line. The EPA has targeted everything from existing coal-fired plants to new plants, coal mining operations, and has been looking at labeling coal ash as a hazardous waste since 2010. Now, unbeknownst to so many individuals and so many of my constituents is the fact that the same coal ash that has been used safely to make, and get this, bricks, cement, asphalt, plastics, and is used as a filler in wood products, is all of a sudden a hazardous waste. I would like the administration to explain to me if coal ash was a hazardous waste, when they used TARP funding for shovel-ready projects to repair roads with asphalt containing, guess what? Coal ash. Was coal ash a hazardous waste last winter when it was used in snow and ice control products to keep roads and pedestrians in Chicago safe? Or was coal ash a hazardous waste when it was used to build the EPA's new headquarters? While I am sure most of my constituents would like to label the EPA's headquarters a Superfund site, I would say let's support this bill, and I can yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman,
if coal ash is reused, it is not a hazardous waste. If it is stored and leaks into our groundwater or our drinking water, it can be very hazardous. The problem with the Republican bill is it doesn't clearly state that public health must be protected, and when they state it, there's no clear enforcement. EPA can't be sure that the job is being done, and even citizens cannot file lawsuits to require it to be done. This is a special interest bill that does not serve the interests of the American people. I'd like to now yield to the gentleman who is the ranking member of one of our energy subcommittees, gentleman from New York. 5 minutes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I thank the gentleman from California, and I thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, the House will consider a bill that provides the states with what they already have, the authority to regulate the disposal of coal ash. H.R. 2218 also virtually eliminates any regulatory role for the Environmental Protection Agency. All of the bill's titles suggest that it is about the beneficial reuse of coal combustion residuals. It has little, if anything, to do with promoting that worthy goal. No one has disputed that it is preferable to reduce the amount of coal ash that ends up in disposal facilities. It saves money and lengthens the productive life of that disposal facility. And it means that a waste product is put to productive use in cement, in wallboard, and in other products. All of those things happen now, and they will happen whether this bill passes or not. Actually, if the bill encouraged stronger standards for disposal, it would likely spur increased recycling. Another opportunity squandered, in my opinion. So if it is not about recycling, what is this bill about? It is about maintaining the status quo. The bill virtually ensures that deficient facilities will indeed remain deficient. And what does that mean? It means that communities and states with weak programs and lax enforcement remain at risk. This bill does not set credible standards to ensure that public health and the environment are protected. Communities whose groundwater sources are known today to be contaminated by toxins leaching from unlined disposal ponds will have to wait at least 10 years before a state would have to act. And even then, there are provisions for granting additional time for an operator to upgrade or repair a leaking facility. We know from recent experience that some of these facilities are structurally unsound. A breach in the dam in Kingston, Tennessee in 2008, in eastern Wisconsin in 2011, and in Martins Creek, Pennsylvania in 2005, all sent coal ash spilling out into waterways and onto the land. H.R. 2188 is not going to help us avoid adding accidents to this list. Very similar bills to this one passed the House several times in the last Congress. They failed to become law, and H.R. 2188, in my opinion, is going to follow that same path. Communities living in the shadow of these facilities deserve to be protected. There is no reason to allow deficient facilities to pollute our water and our air and jeopardize the health of people and communities across this great nation. We can do better. We should do better. My colleagues and I will offer several amendments this morning that, if adopted, would improve this bill. A better legislative effort could resolve the uncertainty surrounding this issue, and more importantly, ensure that our citizens' health and safety are protected. We cannot afford more Kingstons. We do not have to. Without improvements, this legislation will proceed no further in the legislative process. Without improvements, it should not proceed any further. I oppose H.R. 2218 in its present form, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me remind my colleagues some of the special interests. United Mine Workers, Building and Construction Trades, and the Transportation Workers of America. I yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2218, the Coal Residual Reuse and Management Act, an important and bipartisan jobs bill. Today's vote is the culmination of over a 2-year pursuit of a thoughtful, sensible, transparent solution to a serious regulatory challenge. And while the coal ash bill has continued to improve since we first debated and passed the legislation back in 2011, we've stayed true to our original principles. First, the bill sets out strict standards for coal ash management, but leaves the permitting program to the states. This approach is important because it ensures consistent environmental protection, but gives the day-to-day implementation to the states, who have the combination of expertise and dedication to get the job done right for their state. Second, it takes EPA's 3-year proposal to regulate coal ash as hazardous waste off the table. When EPA first published this proposal, they knew that if it overreached, the EPA would face a very tough dilemma. They wanted a permit program for coal ash, but in fact the Solid Waste Disposal Act did not give EPA the authority over coal ash unless it was labeled hazardous. This legislation offers a solution. The administration has stopped asking for the hazardous designation, and good thing, beginning this year, EPA stopped seeking that the agency, instead of the states, do the permitting. The administration has come a long way, and we certainly commend them for that. But meanwhile, we've been listening to and working with the EPA. And on April 11th of this year, EPA testified before our committee by moving past the notion that EPA should write regulations for each state, the administration finally acknowledged that the states are in the best position to implement coal ash permit programs. After our hearing, we had additional meetings with the EPA to discuss the bill, and we ultimately made changes. Can I have 30 additional seconds?
3 additional seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
And we ultimately made changes that the EPA recommended, including adding tough deadlines for state action. This is how the legislative process is supposed to work. The bill reflects crucial input over the last 2 years from House and Senate Republicans, Democrats, and the administration. The time has come to put our pencils down and enact this law so that we can close the regulatory gap. States, utilities, and hundreds of thousands of workers in the recycling industry have been waiting in limbo for a resolution. This bill meets those needs. I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, may I inquire how much time is left on each side?
Gentleman from California has 13 minutes left. The gentleman from Illinois has 15.5 minutes left.
We'll continue to reserve our time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized. Gentleman from California reserved.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 minutes from a member who is very helpful in this legislation, Mr. Latta from Ohio.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I thank the chairman for yielding. I rise today, Mr. Chairman, in support of the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act, designating coal ash as a hazardous waste, which the EPA proposed in June 2010 would not only raise energy prices for families and businesses, but also destroy a large coal ash recycling industry and all the jobs that come with it. H.R. 2218 will protect these jobs by setting minimum standards for the states will be charged with implementing and by providing regulatory certainty that has ceased to exist within the coal ash industry since 2009. If this legislation is not signed into law, the EPA will overturn 30 years of precedent and designate coal ash a hazardous waste despite findings that the Department of Energy, the Federal Highway Administration, state regulatory authorities, and the EPA itself that the toxicity levels in coal ash are well below the criteria that requires a hazardous waste designation. In fact, in the EPA's May 2000 regulatory determination, EPA concluded that coal ash does not warrant regulation as a hazardous waste and that doing so would be environmentally counterproductive. It is estimated that meeting the regulatory disposal requirements under the EPA's proposal would cost between $250 and $450 per ton, as opposed to about $100 per ton under the current system. In 2008, 136 million tons of coal ash was generated. That means that passing this bill could put an additional $20 to $47 million burden on the electricity generators that use coal. Energy costs aside, about 45% of coal ash generated is recycled, being used as an additive in cement, concrete, wallboard, roofing materials, road-based fill materials, and snow and ice control. Designating coal ash as a hazardous waste could halt these beneficial uses, which the EPA estimates will lead to $16.7 million in increased costs per year. It will provide certainty in the coal ash industry and strikes the appropriate balance of strong environmental protection without all the economic consequences of a hazardous waste designation. I urge support of the legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to a very distinguished member of our committee, gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank our ranking member for allowing me time. I rise to express strong support for H.R. 2218, the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act. Last Congress, this chamber twice passed legislation on a bipartisan basis that was weaker than the bill before us today. Last Congress, the effort resulted in legislation to create a state-run waste disposal program with minimum federal requirements while assuring that coal ash can continue to be reused and recycled in everyday products. The legislation before the House today continues that model, but with even greater environmental protections, including accelerated requirements for groundwater monitoring, fixed deadlines for when problems at compound may be cured, and a periodic inspections for the structural integrity of impoundments. Currently, there's a patchwork of state programs to regulate the disposal of coal combustible waste with no federal oversight. H.R. 2218 would be the first time established comprehensive minimum federal standards for coal ash management and disposal and give the EPA the authority to enforce the compliance if a state does not establish a coal residuals permit program or if a state's program does not conform with federal requirements. This legislation would assure that coal ash can be continued to be used beneficially, which puts billions of dollars in our economy annually and protects tens of thousands of jobs in the beneficial reuse industry. Encouraging beneficial reuse of coal ash ensures less of it ends up in landfills, which is good for the environment and good for our economy. I know some members are concerned about the legislation, but we've worked diligently with the majority and stakeholders to make improvements in the bill. The assertions by some of my colleagues that the legislation does not do nothing to protect the environment are making the perfect the enemy of the good. Part of the legislating is moving the ball forward, and we cannot continue to work on legislation. It simply will die in the Senate. This bill is a reasonable compromise and a win-win for the American people that will help protect the environment and create jobs, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back.
Before I yield back my time, I want to point out to my colleagues, this bill will not make it into law. The Senate will not accept it. The President will not support it in its present form because it doesn't protect public health. Coal ash contains arsenic, barium, cadmium, lead, mercury, hexavalent chromium, and other toxic materials. It's a threat not when the coal ash is used for other purposes, but when it's in a disposal site and leaks into our drinking water. And that's what this issue is all about. Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves or yields back? You reserve?
Reserve, yes.
All right. Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague from Texas who's helped us move the bill even in a direction. I'll remind my colleagues that the President has not issued a veto signal on this piece of legislation. I would then like 2 minutes to my friend and colleague from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to express my support for the Coal Residual Reuse and Management Act. I want to thank Mr. McKinley and his staff for their hard work on this very important issue. This common-sense legislation will empower states to safely regulate coal combustion products by fixed standards without overwhelming state budgets or customers' wallets. The recycling and reuse of coal combustion products has great economic and environmental benefits, creating jobs, reducing emissions, extending the life and durability of the nation's roads and bridges, and reducing deposits in landfills and surface impoundments. This legislation will provide the certainty states, utilities, and businesses depend on, all while giving the EPA the authority to protect the public should a state fail to enforce these strong standards. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize Mr. Bouchon from Indiana, a neighbor across from my congressional district, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this